Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about bowel cancer. It's going to be a bowel cancer awareness talks continued from a previous week where there were some technical difficulties. My name is Nazli Aitken. I'm a registered nutritionist. My background is in clinical nutrition, women's health, anti-aging, and prior to that, academia. So I was a lecturer and a researcher for many years in the field of human sciences. So this is a topic that's a little bit close to my heart, or bowels, shall we say. In terms of an outline for today's session, first we're going to be talking about the classification of bowel cancer, the different nomenclature that we use, then the various ways that we might try to get our heads around the staging, which is basically the progression of the disease. Then we're going to look at some basic epidemiology. What we mean by that is at-risk populations. We're not going to have a lot of time to go into detail on this. Obviously, this whole talk is going to be a brief overview, but just to give you some idea of who might be at risk. And then we're going to think about modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. So things that we could change and things that we can't change. Obviously, we're going to focus on things that we can change. And luckily, that makes up the majority of the risk factors for developing bowel cancer. And then we're going to look at some signs and symptoms of the condition, things that you can look out for and you can inform others and help them to look out for. And then finally, we're going to look at screening, so the different ways in which we might check whether we have bowel cancer at its various stages. And then we're going to point you towards some basic resources should you wish to find out more. So in terms of the classification and staging of bowel cancer, what can we say at this point? Well, firstly, there's a lot of different words, phrases to denote the same thing. Bowel cancer is also known as colon cancer, colorectal carcinoma, or adenoma. And it's basically a cancer which is situated in the large bowel or large intestine, technically the cecum, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. So I think at this point, it's nice to just mention a little bit what the large intestine does, why it might be at risk to things. So the large intestine is a really long part of our intestine, but it's not the longest. It's about 6 foot in length. The small intestine is much longer and comes before, which is 21 foot. So the small intestine connects from the stomach to the large intestine, and the large intestine is, at the end of the large intestine, we expel the remaining waste. It's basically a drying organ, meaning that it's going to be removing water from the waste material which is left after the bulk of the digestion process has taken place. But it's also where we extract electrolytes, so minerals, from the waste material. There's also some bacterial activity here, which is very significant. Because dysbiosis, having the wrong type of bacteria, is also a risk factor for bowel cancer. And when I say biosynthesis, what I mean is if we have the right type of bacterial flora, we can make some really interesting nutrients actually from fiber here. Typically, tumors affect these areas which I've circled in red. So that's the ascending colon, the descending colon, and the rectum there, as you can see. So we begin from the ascending colon on the cecum, on the kind of purplish area here that connects to the small intestine. Then it goes to the transverse colon, then the descending colon, then the rectum. That's the kind of areas which are most at risk. But, these can change. It's not something to worry too much about. I wanted to have a look at some very basic pathophysiology for you, and it's a bit of a long way, but what we kind of mean by that is the way in which the pathology, the things that are going wrong, progresses. And it's really important to know in order to really be able to talk about risk factors and in order to be able to talk about diagnosis and screening. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Obviously, this is not a physiology lecture, but just to touch on this so you get a kind of visualization of what we're talking about here. So at this end, at the left-hand side, that's where we're starting. You can see that this is the intestinal wall, by the way. It's a cross-section of the intestinal wall. So going along this way, if you imagine it's like a loop here, we're talking about the bottom or a section of it cut through. So here we've got hyperproliferation, and that's what cancer really is. Cancer is your own cells misbehaving, right? to anthropomorphize it. So firstly, they're going to be growing too much, too many of them, too much cell multiplication. Secondly, they're not going to be behaving or looking as they should. So misbehaving in terms of their appearance and their, metabolic profile, but also growing too much. And thirdly, failing to die, right? So normally cells have this inbuilt, what we call apoptosis element, meaning that when they misbehave, generally they're programmed to just end the cell cycle and end themselves. So what we have on the left-hand side here is hyperproliferation, hyper being too much, proliferation meaning growing too much, right? So we've got the beginning of a cluster of cells there, or a cell there having grown a little bit too much. Then it becomes sort of smaller, then larger, and at this point we call it a polyp. And actually people are really polyps can be very, very common, and it's completely reversible at this stage. By and large, there might be some exceptions, some genetic conditions where it's super tricky to reverse them. But for most people, there's a lot we can do at the polyp stage. And you can see underneath that it says benign, meaning that it's not malignant, and B, that at this point, we don't really consider it to be a cancer. Here, we've got then severe dysplasia, right? This is where we're saying, okay, if this doesn't stop here, it's going to go towards a cancer. Then we've got an adenocarcinoma, and then we have a proper full-on cancer there. The picture of the cancer on the right-hand side, the far right, that's actually a sessile tumor. Those are very difficult to remove, right? There are broadly speaking, two different types of bowel cancer. One is sessile, meaning it's connected to the wall in such a way it would be difficult to cut. The other one, you can see almost like a mushroom, has a very clear beginning and an end, very easy to remove. Okay. So in terms of staging now, and remember the picture that we kind of had before. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there's the kind of T&M staging model. But basically speaking, in the first stage 0, stage 1, you can see that it hasn't really got to a point where it's invaded what we call the musculus propria there, but don't really worry about that too much. The point is that when it gets to stage 2, there's possible involvement of these blood vessels and these lymph vessels. So the green image here, the green network that we're seeing, this is referring to the lymphatic system. So not a lot of people know this, but running parallel to the circulatory system, there's this whole other circulatory system. It's not connected to the heart. It does require you to move for it to move, right? But and it contains white blood cells, not red blood cells. It's kind of like an immune network, like a tube network, but just for immune cells. And so the cancer may, infiltrate tissue such that it connects to the lymph vessels, in which case it's likely to metastasize to the lung, or it can get to a stage where it infiltrates tissue that connects it to the circulatory system, to blood vessels, and then it's most likely to go via the hepatic portal vein to the liver. So these are the two major sites of metastases for colon cancer, and we're hoping obviously to intervene before there's any possible involvement of any of these systems. Right, so let's look at some at-risk populations. I'll let you guys read the slides here, but basically it's the third leading type of cancer-related mortality in men and women. When you look at them separately, put together, it's the second most common cause of cancer death in the UK. That's a slightly different statistic there. So it might be the third leading cause individually, but when you put it together, that's quite a big number. It's leading to the second, and it's 10% of all cancer deaths, right? That doesn't mean that's the total number of people affected, but that's the number of cases in which people, then sort of lose their lives. And we offset some of that number by treatment. Each year, almost 6 in 10 of all bowel cancer deaths, 58% that is, in the UK are in people aged 75 and over. And the highest percentage of that is actually in people aged 90 plus. In terms of prevalence and incidence, I just wanted to give you a few stats that give us some indication as to the kind of socio-economic factors that are involved in bowel cancer related deaths. So mortality rates for bowel cancer and anal cancer, they're overlapping. same thing really, are generally lower in people of non-white minority ethnicity compared to the white ethnic group in England and Wales. And that's likely because obviously it's the majority population, and there's quite a lot of economic disparity. And so the working classes are more likely to be made up of white people, simply because of the way the demographics are with the majority population. Bowel cancer deaths in England are more common in people living in the most deprived areas. So we can put those stats together and just basically say it's a condition which is more likely, not necessarily just to affect, but to then perhaps there might be a delay, a lag in screening and treatment and so on. Relative to the UK average, mortality rates are higher in Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and that again could be linked to sort of socio-economic conditions. So let's spend a bit of time here looking at risk factors. I think this is what we mostly want to be talking about. Okay, so there are modifiable and non-modifiable factors going on here. So firstly, only about 5% of cases are thought to be attributable to genetic conditions. That's really, really important, right? Because these are the things that are going to be very difficult to change. We don't know as yet how to change our genetic makeup. There are two specific genetic conditions which appear to account for most instances of the potentiated inherited risk. Sometimes you can carry a gene, but it's recessive. It doesn't necessarily express itself. But in instances where these genes are expressed, there are two kind of conditions that manifest, which can lead to a hugely increased risk of bowel cancer and tend to be the more difficult forms. So one of those is familial adenomatous polyposis, and the other one is Lynch syndrome. I won't go into these in any specific detail. I think if you have them, it's likely that you will know about it. The image here on the right-hand side is depicting the first condition, and you can see we refer to this as almost like a grape-like clustering, right? There'll be loads of polyps, and it will be primarily in the gastrointestinal tract, which actually includes your mouth and your throat all the way down to your anus, the entire length of the gastrointestinal tract there. But also we need to remember that the gastrointestinal tract is just a type of epithelial tissue, meaning it's a type of skin tissue, right? It's, if you think about it, so skin is kind of like the external environment, but then the external environment is also running through us. There's a hole in us, right, going all the way down, but it's facing the external environment still. The inside of my mouth is still facing the outside world. So they're very similar types of tissues, and people who have these conditions can tend to have polyps also on the outer epithelial tissue sometimes, or a tendency or a risk towards polyps and cancers in other skin tissues. Okay, so talking about risk factors here. So these are the more modifiable risk factors, right? The age, I said more modifiable because age is obviously not a modifiable risk factor, but I want to go into a little bit of detail with that. When we hear things like, age, age is an associated risk factor for this condition or that condition, we need to remember that there's a great deal of plasticity in age. One person at the age of 50 is not the same as another person at the age of 50, right? So age can mean, just de facto biological, chronological sort of aging, right? That every year you suddenly increase in your risk. Or what it can be referring to is the kind of cumulative effects of errors, shall I say errors, that we make over time. So a percentage of this is just age, right? As we age, there's cellular senescence. It becomes harder for tissues to repair themselves, to regulate themselves. But a lot of this is just going to be sort of wear and tear and damage that perhaps our lifestyle has induced. So, remember that and factor that in. There's a lot to fight for. There are many different sort of, the plasticity is quite large in terms of aging. Family history of colorectal cancer is a major risk factor, especially in a first-degree family member, particularly under sort of 60 years, right? So if you know that, I don't know, your mother or your father, so on, has colorectal cancer, had colorectal cancer in the past, that does mean that you have a, an inherited greater risk. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to potentiate, so we don't need to panic there, but it does mean that we need to perhaps have screening earlier, and it should be offered earlier to you if you do have this family history. Smoking and alcohol, and we can add to that, I think, prescriptions, a lot of prescription and non-prescription drugs are going to be a risk factor. Well, for everything, anything that you're putting into your body, which is to an extent at least, toxic and needs to be detoxified, it's going to be a noxious factor for your body, right? And your gastrointestinal tract is generally where those things have the most degree of contact with your body. Alcohol in particular, just the sheer volume of it is a lot for the gastrointestinal walls to take. Certain types of alcohol can be argued in some studies to have more of a risk. Some have some antioxidant capacity. So, some arguments have been made that one is better than the other. I think it's the honest thing to say would be to avoid alcohol completely, particularly if you have a family history. But yeah, I'm not going to go into detail with the different types of alcohol. Let's talk a little bit about meat, because I think this is one of the things that's on everybody's mind. Now, I'm going to start with red meat. At some point, I think it's important to have the discussion of what really is the difference between red meat and white meat. They're both, meat. Essentially, one is more capillarized is the answer, meaning that there's more, capillary is a small blood vessel, meaning that there's more blood supply to what we call red meat. That's the primary difference between it, right? So we can see more red blood cells, right? The iron and so on, the porphyrin ring, giving it that kind of color. So that's the main difference here. And it turns out that in carrying, the part of the hemoglobin, the red blood cell that carries the iron, has a kind of porphyrin ring, which can be cytotoxic to the colon. What do I mean by that? I mean, upon contact with the colon, it can irritate, damage, kill, mutate the cell wall of the colon. Personally, I don't think that's the argument is not as clear cut as that. It also depends what you eat red meat with, right? So for example, if you have red meat with a lot, I don't mean like a few sort of leaves of spinach, but a lot of dark green material. And why does the green matter? Well, in the same way that the red denotes a particular chemical structure, green denotes a particular chemical structure, and that's the kind of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, you might have heard of it in biology. Anyway, it interacts with the porphyrin ring and it kind of completely negates any kind of cytotoxic effect, right? So that's one of the important things. If you're going to have red meat, and I would say even if you're eating, within the guidelines established by agencies that talk about how, public health bodies that talk about how much red meat you should eat, and they say limit it to, about 60 grams or so. But I think the more important thing is to make sure that you have a lot of green material, even if you are staying within those guidelines, so that you can cancel out any potentially toxic effect. The second thing is the quality of the red meat, meaning its kind of provenance. If it comes from grass-fed cows, for example, it tends towards a fatty acid profile, which is anti-inflammatory. And a lot of meats, that are not really eating what they should be eating, being looked after how they should be looked after, tend to produce more inflammatory cytokines and have a fat profile, a lipid profile, which is inflammatory. And inflammatory means aggravating the immune system and causing unwanted reactions. So I think the provenance of red meat is very important. The accompaniment of red meat is very important. We tend to, in the West, have red meat along with things like potatoes, deep fried in sunflower oil, which is, again, quite inflammatory, high in omega-6. So the combination of things, the provenance of things, they really do matter. The story is not super clear cut. Then going back to processed meat, I think that's the other issue here, because a lot of the time when we say we're having red meat, we're actually having super processed red meat, right? Things like sausages, burgers, they have, the more processes something goes through, the more of a noxious agent it potentially becomes. I mean, partly because we add things to it, right? We add things like nitrites and things that might, kill bacteria and control the water activity. And all of these things are also going to affect our cells, right? So there are things contained in processed foods that our body is just not prepared for from an evolutionary point of view. We haven't evolved to deal with the added chemicals and so on. But also, the more you process meat, generally you tend to, or process anything, you generally tend to remove the useful stuff, the things that would constitute, nutrients, particularly micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, and you tend to leave behind the things which are just energy dense, and they need vitamins and minerals to be processed. So you create errors in processing. Anyway, I'll leave the red meat topic there. Then BMI is a big deal. I mean, as our weight increases, and I don't just mean being a little bit overweight, and this isn't an aesthetic debate. I mean, when you're heading towards clinically obese, you're in an inflamed state again, and that would probably be the topic for another talk. But I think it's fair to say that having an elevated BMI is a risk factor for all non-communicable diseases. And these are the diseases that characterize modern industrialized nations. Again, in that connection, having a diet which is inflammatory on top of having a physical body composition which is inflammatory is very relevant. So there's a lot of different factors that go into whether your diet is inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, but the main one, the one which would have a very global effect very quickly, is how much omega-6 you consume versus how much omega-3 you consume, right? So most people in the West, let's say this should be 1-to-1, right? It might be 3-to-1, that might still be okay. But most people in the West, it's about 24 or 16 in favor of omega-6. And omega-6 is the precursor for inflammatory hormones which push our system towards a state of having an overactive immune system, which is not helpful, right? It's not helpful. It creates lots of inappropriate reactions in the body, which damage our own cells and create genetic mutations potentially, which can result in cells misbehaving and turning towards a cancerous phenotype. The other one is too much glucose. Glucose is seriously cytotoxic. The body tries very hard to keep it within certain parameters, and it's hugely inflammatory as well. I'm talking about refined glucose, and I'm not necessarily, I don't want to include within this fruits and vegetables. On that note, I want to talk about fiber. I think this is one of the major misconceptions that people have about bowel cancer is, I need more fiber. Too much fiber is worse for you than too little fiber. And studies which look at people who add fiber to their diet specifically through, for example, supplements, there are sachets and mixtures that contain fiber. These don't actually tend to help at all. So there's a J-shaped risk curve with fiber, meaning too much fiber is a risk, right? So I don't want to recommend personally things like, very dark rices and things like that. The fiber that you should get should come from fruits and vegetables, which have lots of additional useful polyphenolic compounds. I don't think in an attempt to avoid bowel cancer, we should be adding extracted fiber into our diet. I think that would be more harmful than you imagine. And there are other conditions that can manifest later in life as the accumulated effects of excess fiber take hold. But fruits and vegetables, they contain magical elements. They contain magical polyphenolic compounds that can be incredibly useful to a range of conditions which we face in the West. I've got an additional thing on pathophysiology that I've stuck in just here. I'm not going to get into it in detail, but I just want to point out, right, I was talking earlier about the different bacterial flora that we might have and how that might impact the development of colon cancer. And forget all the long words here, right? These are just talking about different sort of elements involved in the change. But you can see here that a healthy microbiome, right, is associated with normal epithelium. That just means skin within the large intestine. And then you can see that an infection, that's what it says over the arrow here, an infection, for example, with salmonella, doesn't have to be salmonella, creates dysbiosis, meaning the wrong type of bacteria, right? Bacteria produce stuff chemicals. They're also, you know, like fighters, like, yeah, they're kind of like a unit of things. They produce their own chemicals, they do their own things. And you can see that whatever they've produced, whatever they've been making and leaking out into the environment of the gut has caused hyper proliferation here, which is one of the first signs of a mutation leading towards a cancerous phenotype. And you can see very quickly that it's generated inflammation. If you look at the bottom here, that's interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. You don't need to worry about it too much, but as the body's tried to respond to that and not being able to, we've moved towards an adenoma and so on. So this is just to point out to you, we do know the direct kind of pathophysiological pathways by which bacteria and dysbiosis can also lead to colon cancer. This is, and I promise this is the last complicated slide here, but I found this really interesting because we were talking about, this is talking about the different things that could potentially intervene. So if you look at these lines, the red lines going down with a sort of bar at the bottom, these are things which we know could stop each successive stage, right? And what do we have here? We have NSAIDs, which is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. We also have folate, and I don't want to get into statins because I think that's, you know, for somebody else to talk about. But I think it's very interesting to note that folate actually is quite an interesting nutrient, you know, vitamin B9. It can deal with single nucleotide polymorphism. So any aberration in the DNA, which is making something behave as it shouldn't behave. So people with a good folate status and NSAIDs, I'm going to take to talk about low dose aspirin, for example, right? Which stops COX-2 overexpression, but other anti-inflammatory drugs as well. But in low doses, they're very dose dependent, can stop these conversions to the next stage. And people with a tendency towards polyps might want to speak to somebody, you know, a doctor and so on, about the possibility of taking low doses of anti-inflammatory drugs occasionally to just to reverse any possible polyps that may be developing in the gastrointestinal tract, and make sure you have a good folate status. Okay, so according to cancer research, 54% of cases are preventable. That's really good, although we know that 95% of risk factors are modifiable. So, you know, we can take each stat with a pinch of salt and hope for a better thing, I think. Caused by too little fiber, again, that's because not many people are, you know, eating extreme amounts of fiber, but please don't also overdo it. 13% of cases are thought to be caused by eating meat. I think, you know, it's highlighting processed meat there. Notice that it's not talking about red meat, but please, you know, beware about process. It's not just for colon cancer, all types of cancer. You can equate the exact percentage of your diet, which is made up of processed food, with your exact risk of cancer per se in a lot of studies. So try to avoid processed foods and try to think about what accompanies them. And obesity, 11% there. Okay, so some signs and symptoms quickly. In a lot of cases, it's going to be non-symptomatic, asymptomatic, right? Particularly in the earlier stages, which is why screening is so important. But sort of the key symptoms to look out for: abdominal pain, weight loss, poor appetite, vomiting, nausea. These can be an indication of a lot of different conditions. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Stool changes, and I want to bring my trusted pencil here. If your fecal matter is coming out pencil shaped, that's a good indication that some sort of obstruction in your colon is pushing that, molding that fecal matter into this pencil shape. That's a very, very specific sign. And at that point, most definitely, if not previously, go to see a doctor. Bowel habit changes, you know, one day diarrhea, the next moment constipation, these kinds of unusual fluctuations in your bowel habits. That's another major warning sign. Melena and hematochezia. These are, well, melena is generally related to upper esophageal or upper gastrointestinal tract, sometimes ascending colon bleeding, and it creates a kind of black colored stool, right? Because by the time the blood comes, you know, if it's very high up, it will get dark by the time you excrete it. Hematochezia is more likely to be caused by rectal bleeding, and you literally get blood in your stool. But needless to say, any kind of tar-like appearance, any kind of blood coming out, sometimes it can just be hemorrhoids, or but you should investigate, maybe try some medication for hemorrhoids, and if it doesn't resolve in a few days, maybe speak to your doctor about it, or rather do speak to your doctor about it. And then obstipation, which is not just sort of constipation, but also gas and other things really causing a lot of pain. Big sign of bowel cancer. And remember, bowel cancer is the most common cause of colorectal obstruction. Other things to look out for: rectal fullness or mass and rectal tenesmus. So this is this feeling that you need to evacuate your bowel, but the rectum is in fact empty. So you've got this sense of incomplete evacuation, or you haven't been able to evacuate at all, but it feels full there. I suppose this is one of those things, if you have it, you would know what I'm talking about. If you don't, it might be a little bit difficult to picture. Finally, I want to end on screening. So the NHS bowel screening program was introduced in 2006, aims to identify bowel cancer at an early stage where treatment is more likely to be successful. Good news is 5-year survival rate following diagnosis is 59%, and most of that 59% is made by people screening in good time and early detection. So it's recommended age is 50 to 74. Again, if you have a family history, it might be wiser to do that much earlier. And in a lot of countries, it is much earlier, like in the US, it's 45. Approximately 69% of people in England have taken up the bowel cancer screening. I suppose there might be some cases where for some reason you haven't been contacted. If you haven't, please do contact your local NHS provider. And if you simply just haven't responded to the invitation, please do consider that. It does save lives. You can also take things into your own hand and order a fit test. We do that. And so if anybody wants to contact us, businesses want to contact us, please do. But the NHS and we work via what we call a fit test. That's a fecal immunochemical test. And so this is what will be sent to you automatically every 2 years. And it's an early screening detection method. You take a little bit of a fecal matter and you put it in a tube, very simple, you send it off. And it can also detect things like polyps, right, potentially. But a positive test will therefore indicate the need for further investigations rather than, that 100% that it means that you have cancer. But it's a very good, very useful test and very simple to use. So I'm going to just point out that if you want more information, the best place to go is bowel cancer screening guidelines on the NHS. And there's also a phone number here, 0800 707 6060, that you can call if you've lost or misplaced your test. That's useful to know. And finally, I'm going to leave you on the Trustpilot page. Okay.